The smoke curled upward in elegant spirals, photographed in perfect lighting, with beautiful people laughing in sun-drenched fields. For decades, this was the image tobacco companies sold to the world. But behind those glossy advertisements lay one of the most devastating corporate deceptions in human history. A conspiracy so vast, so carefully orchestrated, that it would eventually claim over 100 million lives in the 20th century alone. This is the story of the billionaires who knew they were selling poison and did everything in their power to hide that truth. In the early 1950s, something alarming began happening in hospitals across America. Doctors were seeing an unprecedented surge in lung cancer cases. The disease had been relatively rare before, but suddenly it was becoming an epidemic. Medical researchers started asking uncomfortable questions, and their investigations kept pointing to one common factor: cigarettes. The tobacco industry, which had grown into a massive economic force, was about to face the greatest threat to its existence. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The tobacco executives didn't just defend their product when the science emerged. They already knew. Internal documents that would later be uncovered in lawsuits revealed that tobacco companies had conducted their own research and understood perfectly well that cigarettes caused cancer and addiction. They knew their product killed people, and they made a calculated decision: profit over human life. Let's go back to 1953, a pivotal year in this saga. The major tobacco companies were facing mounting pressure as scientific studies linking smoking to lung cancer began appearing in medical journals. Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham had published groundbreaking research showing that painting cigarette tar on the backs of mice caused tumours. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The industry needed a strategy, and they needed it fast. On December 15, 1953, the presidents of America's 4 largest tobacco companies met in secret at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Joining them was John Hill, the head of Hill & Knowlton, one of the most powerful public relations firms in the country. What emerged from that meeting would become known as one of the most successful and deadly PR campaigns in history. They decided they wouldn't fight the science with denials alone. Instead, they would create doubt, manufacture controversy, and position themselves as champions of scientific research. Just weeks later, on January 4, 1954, they published a full-page advertisement in over 400 newspapers across America. It was titled, "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers." In smooth, reasonable language, it acknowledged the public's concerns while simultaneously dismissing them. The statement claimed that the industry accepted an interest in people's health as a basic responsibility and announced the formation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. They pledged to fund independent scientific research into the health effects of smoking. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. The message was clear. We're the good guys. We care about the truth, and we're going to get to the bottom of this with real science. But the reality was exactly the opposite. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to obscure it. They would fund research that had nothing to do with smoking and disease, creating a smokescreen of scientific activity. Whenever studies emerged showing the dangers of cigarettes, they would point to their own research and claim the science was inconclusive and that more research was needed. Inside the companies, scientists were conducting research that painted a damning picture. In 1958, a scientist named Helmut Wacom at Philip Morris was investigating the biological effects of cigarette smoke. His research clearly showed harmful effects. But when he tried to present his findings, he was shut down. The companies weren't interested in what their scientists were discovering. They only cared about protecting their profits. By the 1960s, the evidence linking smoking to cancer had become overwhelming. In 1964, the US Surgeon General Luther Terry released a landmark report declaring that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. It should have been a death blow to the industry. Instead, the tobacco companies doubled down on their strategy of denial and deception. They attacked the methodology of studies that showed harm. They funded scientists who would raise questions about the research. They created the impression that there was a legitimate scientific debate when, in reality, the medical community had reached a consensus. The addiction factor was even more sinister. While publicly denying that cigarettes were addictive, tobacco companies were secretly researching nicotine delivery systems to make their products more addictive. They studied the precise chemistry of addiction, experimented with different tobacco blends, and engineered their cigarettes to deliver nicotine more efficiently to the brain. Documents that emerged decades later showed they referred to cigarettes as nicotine delivery devices and discussed strategies to keep people hooked. One particularly disturbing memo from a Brown and Williamson executive in 1963 stated it plainly. We are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. But publicly, these same companies would spend the next 3 decades insisting that cigarettes weren't addictive. In 1994, the heads of 7 major tobacco companies would stand before Congress, raise their right hands, and swear under oath that nicotine was not addictive. It was perjury on a massive scale, but they felt untouchable. The manipulation extended far beyond scientific deception. Tobacco companies poured money into political campaigns, ensuring that friendly legislators would block regulation. They hired armies of lawyers to fight every lawsuit, no matter how sympathetic the plaintiff. A mother dying of lung cancer? A father whose smoking had killed him, leaving his family destitute? It didn't matter. The companies fought every single case, knowing that most families couldn't afford the legal battle. Their strategy was simple. Litigate, litigate, litigate. Bankrupt the opposition through legal fees and delays. They also targeted the most vulnerable, children and teenagers. Despite publicly claiming they didn't market to minors, internal documents revealed extensive research into youth smoking patterns and marketing campaigns specifically designed to attract young smokers. They understood that if someone didn't start smoking by age 18, they probably never would. Getting teenagers hooked was essential to their long-term business model. The Joe Camel campaign by R.J. Reynolds is one of the most infamous examples. Launched in 1987, Joe Camel was a cartoon character who appeared in advertisements as a cool, smooth character, surrounded by beautiful women and living an exciting life. The company claimed it was targeting adult smokers. But studies showed that by 1991, Joe Camel was as recognizable to 6-year-olds as Mickey Mouse. The campaign was wildly successful at attracting underage smokers. Camel's market share among youth smokers jumped from less than 1% to over 30%. The company was essentially training children to become addicted to their product. In developing countries, the tactics were even more ruthless. As Western nations began implementing tobacco control measures in the 1980s and 1990s, tobacco companies aggressively expanded into Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They fought against health warnings, sponsored youth-oriented events, handed out free cigarettes, and used their economic power to pressure governments. In some countries, they distributed cigarettes to children outside schools. The WHO estimates that tobacco will kill 1 billion people in the 21st century, with the majority of deaths occurring in developing nations. The billionaires behind these companies lived in extraordinary luxury while millions suffered from the products they sold. Take the Coleman family, who controlled much of Philip Morris for decades. They owned vast estates, collected priceless art, and moved in the higher circles of society. Or the heirs to the R.J. Reynolds fortune, who built massive philanthropic legacies while the family's tobacco business addicted and killed millions. These weren't just business people making morally neutral decisions. They were architects of a death machine who knew exactly what they were doing. The turning point came in the 1990s when a series of whistleblowers began emerging from inside the tobacco companies. These brave individuals risked everything to expose the truth. Jeffrey Wigand, a former research executive at Brown & Williamson, went public with explosive revelations about how the company had manipulated nicotine levels and lied about addiction. His story would later be dramatized in the film The Insider, but the real-life events were even more harrowing. He faced death threats, surveillance, and a coordinated smear campaign designed to destroy his credibility. Merrill Williams, a paralegal who had worked on tobacco industry documents, secretly copied thousands of pages of internal memos and research papers. These documents revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. Company executives discussing cancer-causing agents, strategies to target children, plans to suppress research findings, and countless other damning revelations. When these documents began circulating, they became known as the Tobacco Papers, and they provided the smoking gun that anti-tobacco advocates had been seeking for decades. In 1998, the industry finally faced a reckoning. After years of lawsuits by state attorneys general seeking to recover healthcare costs from smoking-related illnesses, the major tobacco companies agreed to a master settlement agreement. They would pay $206 billion over 25 years to 46 states. They agreed to restrict marketing, particularly to youth. They agreed to fund anti-smoking campaigns. It was the largest civil settlement in U.S. history. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even this massive settlement was, in many ways, a victory for the tobacco companies. They weren't forced to admit wrongdoing. They weren't held criminally liable. And the settlement actually protected them from future lawsuits by states. Most importantly, they were still allowed to sell their deadly product. The companies simply raised prices to cover the settlement costs, passing the expense on to addicted consumers who couldn't quit. The billionaires behind big tobacco remained billionaires. The human cost of this conspiracy is almost incomprehensible. In the United States alone, smoking kills about 480,000 people every year. That's more than AIDS, car accidents, illegal drugs, murders, and suicides combined. Globally, tobacco kills over 8 million people annually. Every single one of those deaths can be traced back to the decisions made in corporate boardrooms by executives who prioritized profit over human life. The stories of individual victims reveal the true tragedy. There was Rose Cipollone, a New Jersey housewife who started smoking at age 16 and died of lung cancer at 58. Her husband sued the tobacco companies, and the case became a landmark trial where internal documents were exposed. Rose had smoked cigarettes advertised as safe, with filters and low tar. The companies had known these marketing claims were false. She died believing the lies they had told her. There was Grady Carter, a Florida man who developed lung cancer after smoking Lucky Strikes for decades. He had tried to quit multiple times, but couldn't because of the addiction. When he sued, Brown & Williamson's defense was that he should have known smoking was dangerous and that his cancer was his own fault. The jury saw through this victim blaming and awarded him damages, but the company appealed, dragging out the case for years. Grady died before seeing final justice. Consider the children born with birth defects because their mothers smoked during pregnancy, following the tobacco industry's assurances that their products were safe. Think about the families bankrupted by medical bills, the parents who died young, the chronic disease sufferers spending their final years hooked to oxygen tanks. Behind every statistic is a human being whose life was destroyed by a product that companies knew was deadly. The international dimension of this story reveals even more disturbing patterns. In China, which now has over 300 million smokers, tobacco companies partnered with the government-controlled tobacco monopoly to expand the market. They knew that millions of Chinese men would die from smoking-related diseases, but they saw it as an acceptable cost of doing business. In Indonesia, where tobacco advertising regulations are minimal, companies sponsor concerts and sporting events aimed at young people. The average age when Indonesian children start smoking is 12 years old. In Africa, tobacco companies have fought desperately against health regulations, arguing that restrictions would harm economic development. They've used their economic power to bully smaller nations into submission. When countries like Uruguay and Australia implemented plain packaging laws, requiring cigarettes to be sold in standardized packages with large health warnings, tobacco companies sued under international trade agreements, claiming these regulations violated their intellectual property rights. They were essentially arguing that their right to brand their deadly product was more important than public health. The tobacco industry also pioneered techniques of corporate deception that would be adopted by other industries. The strategy of manufacturing doubt about scientific consensus, of funding think tanks and front groups to muddy the waters, of using legal warfare to exhaust opponents. All of these tactics were perfected by Big Tobacco and later used by industries fighting climate science, chemical regulations, and other public health measures. The tobacco playbook became a blueprint for corporate malfeasance. Let's talk about the specific billionaires who profited from this misery. The Pritzker family, heirs to the Hyatt Hotel fortune, also had substantial tobacco holdings and served on tobacco company boards. They were sophisticated, educated people who certainly understood what their investments were funding. The Duke family, descended from the American Tobacco Company founder, maintained their vast wealth through tobacco money even as they built prestigious universities and cultural institutions. There's a bitter irony in prestigious hospitals and research centres funded by money earned from products that fill those hospitals with patients. David Dangor, a British billionaire whose family made their fortune in tobacco, lived in a mansion filled with art treasures while his family's products killed people across the developing world. The Uri and Hoffmann families in Switzerland, heirs to pharmaceutical fortunes, also maintained major tobacco investments, profiting from the very illnesses their pharmaceutical companies would then treat. The moral contradiction was staggering, but the money was too good to pass up. These billionaires lived in a bubble of extreme wealth and privilege, insulated from the consequences of their actions. They attended charity galas and spoke about giving back to society while their core businesses destroyed lives. They funded medical research while profiting from products that caused disease. They built museums and libraries while their companies marketed poison to children. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this dual existence is almost incomprehensible. The scientific fraud perpetrated by these companies went far beyond simple denial. They established research institutes with legitimate-sounding names that existed solely to produce industry-friendly science. They paid scientists to publish articles questioning the mainstream research. They held conferences where carefully selected researchers would present findings that supported the industry's position. They created a parallel scientific universe where smoking wasn't really dangerous, where the evidence was always questionable, where more research was always needed. One particularly insidious tactic was the use of so-called experts for hire. These were credentialed scientists who would testify in court cases or provide quotes to media outlets casting doubt on the health risks of smoking. Some genuinely believed in their positions, but many were essentially hired guns who said what they were paid to say. The tobacco companies maintained rosters of these experts and would deploy them strategically whenever threatening research emerged. This practice corrupted scientific discourse and made it harder for the public to distinguish genuine expertise from industry propaganda. The legal strategy employed by tobacco companies was particularly cruel because it targeted individuals at their most vulnerable. When someone dying of lung cancer would sue, the company's lawyers would put them through grueling depositions, sometimes lasting days, forcing them to recount their entire smoking history. They would dig into every aspect of the plaintiff's life, looking for anything that could be used to blame the victim. Did they eat unhealthy foods? Live near a highway? Work in a factory? Any alternative explanation for their cancer would be amplified and exaggerated. The companies maintained a policy of never settling cases, no matter how sympathetic the plaintiff or how strong the evidence. The reasoning was strategic. If they settled even one case, it would open the floodgates to millions more. So they fought every single lawsuit to the bitter end, knowing that most individuals would run out of money or die before getting justice. It was legal warfare as a weapon of attrition, and it was devastatingly effective. In the rare cases where juries did award damages to plaintiffs, the companies would appeal repeatedly, tying up the cases in court for years or even decades. Many plaintiffs died before seeing a penny. Even when courts upheld verdicts, the companies would often negotiate drastically reduced settlements, knowing that the families were desperate and exhausted. The system was rigged in favor of those with unlimited resources. The advertising and marketing campaigns deserve special attention because they reveal the calculated nature of the deception. In the 1950s, when concerns about smoking and health first emerged, tobacco companies began marketing safer cigarettes. They introduced filters, which they claimed would protect smokers from harmful substances. They promoted light and low-tar cigarettes as healthier alternatives. All of these claims were false. The filters didn't significantly reduce harm, and the light cigarettes were often even more dangerous because smokers would inhale more deeply or smoke more cigarettes to get the same nicotine hit. The companies knew these marketing claims were fraudulent. Internal documents show scientists and executives discussing the fact that filters didn't make cigarettes safe. But the marketing was incredibly successful because it allowed smokers to continue their habit while feeling like they were making a healthier choice. Millions of people who might have quit instead switched to light cigarettes, thinking they were protecting themselves. They weren't. They were just as likely to develop cancer and other diseases. The targeting of women was particularly cynical. In the 1960s and 70s, as the women's liberation movement gained momentum, tobacco companies seized the opportunity to associate smoking with female empowerment. The Virginia Slims campaign, with its slogan, "You've come a long way, baby," positioned cigarettes as symbols of independence and equality. The advertising showed strong, confident women who smoked because they were in control of their own lives. It was feminist rhetoric in service of addiction and death. The strategy worked devastatingly well. Smoking rates among women, which had been much lower than men's, began rising sharply. Lung cancer rates among women, which had been relatively rare, started climbing. Today, lung cancer kills more women than breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and uterine cancer combined. The tobacco companies had successfully marketed disease and death to women by wrapping it in the language of liberation. The international expansion of tobacco companies in the late 20th century represented a new phase of the conspiracy. As smoking rates declined in wealthy countries due to health awareness and regulations, the companies looked to developing nations as growth markets. They used their economic and political power to force open these markets, often threatening trade sanctions against countries that resisted. Once inside, they would aggressively market their products, sponsor popular events, and work to prevent the implementation of health regulations. In countries without strong regulatory frameworks, the companies could do things they could no longer get away with in the West. They could advertise on television and radio. They could sponsor sporting events and concerts. They could place cigarettes in movies and TV shows. They could hand out free samples. All the tactics that had been banned or restricted in Europe and North America were deployed in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The result was predictable. rising smoking rates, particularly among young people, and the beginning of a health catastrophe that is still unfolding. The companies also work to undermine international health efforts. When the World Health Organization began developing the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, a global treaty aimed at reducing tobacco use, the tobacco industry mounted a massive lobbying campaign to weaken it. They enlisted friendly governments to oppose strong measures. They funded think tanks to produce reports arguing that tobacco control measures didn't work or would harm economies. They tried to position themselves as partners in public health, offering to work with governments on sensible regulations that would, of course, be much weaker than what health advocates wanted. Despite these efforts, the Framework Convention was adopted in 2003 and has been ratified by 182 countries. It requires signatories to implement measures like warning labels, advertising bans, smoke-free public places, and tobacco tax increases. But the tobacco industry continues fighting implementation at every level, using their wealth and influence to delay, weaken, or prevent effective regulations. The battle continues today. The personal stories of tobacco executives who had crises of conscience are particularly revealing. Victor DeNoble was a research scientist at Philip Morris in the 1980s who was studying nicotine addiction using rats. His research clearly demonstrated that nicotine was addictive. The rats would self-administer it compulsively. When he presented his findings, he was told to stop his research immediately. The company didn't want proof of addiction in their own files. DeNoble refused and eventually went public with his research, becoming one of the crucial whistleblowers who exposed the industry's deception. Bennett LeBeau, a corporate raider who took over Liggett Group, one of the smaller tobacco companies, eventually broke ranks with the industry in 1997. He agreed to settle lawsuits against his company and, crucially, to cooperate with plaintiffs' attorneys by providing internal documents. His defection sent shockwaves through the industry because it shattered the unified front they had maintained for decades. The documents he provided were used as evidence in countless subsequent cases. But for every executive who developed a conscience, there were dozens who continued profiting from misery without apparent regret. Many of these individuals went to their graves wealthy and respected, never facing consequences for their role in one of history's greatest public health catastrophes. They were lauded as business leaders, served on prestigious boards, had university buildings named after them, and were remembered fondly by friends and family. The disconnect between their public reputation and their actual legacy is profound. The economic dimension of the tobacco story reveals how profit motives can overwhelm every other consideration. Tobacco companies were among the most profitable businesses in the world throughout the 20th century. The profit margins were extraordinary. Tobacco is a cheap crop, cigarettes are inexpensive to manufacture, and addicted customers provide a reliable revenue stream. Shareholders loved tobacco stocks because they generated consistent returns, regardless of economic conditions. During recessions, people might cut back on luxuries, but addicts still bought cigarettes. This profitability created enormous resistance to change. Wall Street analysts would punish tobacco companies that seemed to be backing away from aggressive marketing or accepting stricter regulations. Shareholders demanded growth, which meant getting more people to smoke or getting smokers to smoke more. The financial incentives all pushed in one direction: sell more cigarettes, regardless of the consequences. In this system, executives who might have wanted to act more responsibly faced pressure from investors to maximize profits above all else. The tobacco companies also became deeply embedded in the broader economy through investments, sponsorships, and partnerships. They sponsored sporting events, arts organizations, and charitable causes. Universities accepted their research funding. Politicians relied on their campaign contributions. Small businesses like convenience stores depended on tobacco sales for a significant portion of their revenue. This web of economic connections created constituencies with interests in protecting the tobacco industry, making reform more difficult. The taxation of tobacco products became a major public policy issue. Health advocates argued for high taxes to discourage smoking, particularly among price-sensitive young people. The tobacco industry fought these efforts viciously, arguing that high taxes would fuel smuggling and organized crime. They had a point. Illicit tobacco trade is a real problem, but their concern wasn't really about crime. It was about maintaining sales volume. Every study showed that higher prices reduced smoking rates, which was exactly what they wanted to prevent. The story of tobacco litigation is a saga unto itself. For decades, the tobacco companies had an astonishing record. They had never lost a personal injury lawsuit and paid a judgment. Hundreds of cases were filed, and they won them all or got them dismissed. They had unlimited resources for legal defense, teams of the best lawyers money could buy, and strategies perfected over decades of litigation. Plaintiffs' attorneys, working on contingency fees, often couldn't sustain the years-long battles required to get to trial, let alone through appeals. The breakthrough came in the 1990s when state attorneys general began filing cases not on behalf of individual smokers, but to recover Medicaid costs of treating smoking-related illnesses. These cases were different because states had the resources to sustain prolonged litigation, and the legal theory was harder for tobacco companies to defend against. The companies couldn't argue that states had assumed the risk of smoking or that states were contributorily negligent. The mounting threat of these cases, combined with the exposure of internal documents through discovery, eventually forced the industry to negotiate the Master Settlement Agreement. Even in defeat, the tobacco companies found ways to protect their interests. The settlement funds were paid out over 25 years, meaning the companies could continue operating and generating revenue to cover the payments. They weren't required to admit that smoking caused disease or that they had acted improperly. The agreement actually protected them from future state lawsuits, giving them a form of legal immunity. And most significantly, they were still allowed to sell cigarettes. For an industry that had caused so much harm, it was a remarkably gentle punishment. The continuing evolution of tobacco products shows that the industry hasn't fundamentally changed its approach. When traditional cigarettes came under increasing pressure, companies developed heat-not-burn products and e-cigarettes, marketing them as safer alternatives. Some of these products may indeed be less harmful than regular cigarettes, but the companies are using the same playbook, targeting young people with appealing flavors and slick marketing, downplaying health risks, and fighting regulation at every turn. The emergence of vaping and e-cigarettes has created a new public health challenge. A generation of young people who had low smoking rates are now becoming addicted to nicotine through vaping devices. Companies like Juul, which was partially owned by Altria, the parent company of Philip Morris, explicitly marketed to teenagers with flavors like cucumber and mango, sleek designs that look like USB drives, and social media campaigns featuring young influencers. The result was an explosion of youth vaping, with some surveys showing that over 25% of high school students were using e-cigarettes. The cycle is repeating itself. Just as tobacco companies once claimed cigarettes weren't harmful or addictive, vaping companies initially claimed their products were just harmless water vapor. Just as tobacco companies targeted youth while claiming they didn't, vaping companies used marketing tactics obviously designed to appeal to teenagers while insisting they were only targeting adult smokers. Just as tobacco companies fought regulation, vaping companies are fighting FDA oversight and flavor bans. The playbook hasn't changed, only the product delivery system has evolved. Looking back at this history, what's most striking is how preventable it all was. At multiple points, better decisions could have averted immense suffering. If tobacco executives had responded to early evidence of health harms with honesty instead of deception, if they had prioritized public health over profits, if they had accepted regulation instead of fighting it, millions of lives could have been saved. Instead, they chose denial, manipulation, and profit maximization, condemning millions to preventable deaths. The legacy of Big Tobacco's deception extends far beyond the tobacco industry itself. The strategies they pioneered, manufacturing scientific doubt, funding front groups, using litigation as a weapon, targeting children, exploiting developing nations, prioritizing short-term profits over long-term consequences, have been adopted by other industries facing scientific evidence of harm. The fossil fuel industry's response to climate science bears unmistakable similarities to tobacco's response to cancer research. The same consultants and PR firms have sometimes even been involved. The human toll continues to mount. While smoking rates have declined in many wealthy countries, they remain high globally, and the absolute number of smokers worldwide is still increasing due to population growth. Tobacco is on track to kill 1 billion people in the 21st century, making it the single deadliest consumer product in human history. Every one of those deaths will be the downstream consequence of decisions made in corporate boardrooms by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The billionaires who built and profited from tobacco empires largely escaped accountability. Most died wealthy and respected, their fortunes intact, their reputations protected by carefully crafted legacies of philanthropy and business leadership. Some of their descendants continue to live off wealth generated by addiction and death, though they've often diversified into other industries. The money has been laundered through enough transactions and generations that its origins in human suffering have been obscured. What lessons can we draw from this dark chapter in corporate history? First, that profit motives alone cannot be trusted to protect public health. Strong regulation is essential. Second, that corporations will lie systematically when their bottom line is threatened, and we must be skeptical of industry-funded science and industry claims about product safety. Third, that transparency is crucial. The documents that exposed tobacco industry deception were kept secret for decades, and it was only when they were forced into public view that the full truth emerged. We must also recognize that this story isn't really over. Tobacco companies continue operating, continue selling their deadly products, and continue fighting regulation. New generations are being addicted to nicotine through novel delivery systems. Developing nations are experiencing the full force of the tobacco epidemic that wealthy countries experienced decades earlier. The billionaires who control these companies today are making the same choice their predecessors made: profits over human life. The story of Big Tobacco is ultimately a story about power, greed, and the capacity of human beings to rationalize, causing immense harm when the financial incentives are strong enough. It's a reminder that business success and moral bankruptcy can coexist, that respectability and villainy are not opposites, and that some of the greatest crimes in history are perpetrated not by obvious monsters, but by people who see themselves as simply doing business. The billionaires who sold poison knew what they were selling. They just didn't care enough to stop.